I want to thank everybody for attending our club luncheon, and I'd like to mention our club luncheon sponsor. Brechta and Brechta Law Firm has been supporting luncheon for several years now, and their areas of practice include employee rights, wills, trusts, and estate planning, business planning, real estate, and general civil litigation. So if you need legal help, please think about calling Brechta and Brechta. The goal of the club is to bring together all Democrats, from the most conservative to the most progressive, to celebrate our shared values, appreciate who we are, and to work together to put more Democrats in office. Our program today will feature Mark Rudd, and I'll introduce him shortly. So we would like everyone to stay muted, except for Mark and myself and Karen Pontius, who will be handling questions. If you want to submit a question during the luncheon, and you can start right now if you have one, please use the chat feature on Zoom. Please do not unmute yourself and speak. Send your questions to everyone in the chat window. So there's a little drop down. Make sure you've got it set to everyone. If you're having trouble with your internet connectivity, you may want to disable your video. Audio only works better on slow connections. This Zoom meeting is being recorded, and it'll be available within a few days for viewing. You can choose speaker mode, typically in the upper right corner, which will bring up a larger video of the person speaking. And while the La Plata Dems are okay on funds for right now, some of the biggest fundraisers have had to be canceled due to the pandemic. So I would encourage everyone to donate to the party, and monthly donations are particularly appreciated, and you can set those up on ActBlue, and monthly donations make it very easy for you to give to the party with relatively little pain. This is our third luncheon, club luncheon for 2021. The Club Luncheon Committee has been working to bring some great programs for the coming year, and I think you'll really enjoy them. Next month, we'll feature a forum for LPEA candidates, and I'd like you to note that the luncheon next month will be on the second Tuesday, not the first. So that's May 11th instead of May 4th, and that's due to a change in LPEA's election schedule. So if anyone has any announcements to make, please enter something in the chat window, and we'll recognize you at the end of the luncheon. So I'm now going to introduce Mark Rudd. He was a leader of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, at Columbia University in the spring of 1968, and participated in the largest student strike up to that time against the university's institutional racism and its research in support of the war in Vietnam. He then became the last national secretary of SDS in 1969 and a founder of the ill-fated Weather Underground in 1970. He was a federal fugitive for 7.5 years. In 1978, he moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he has taught at the community college and organized in the movements against nuclear waste dumping and nuclear weapons, for Native American rights, solidarity with the people of Central America, creating a teachers union, for environmental justice, and to build a progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So let's give Mark Rudd a big virtual welcome.
A virtual welcome, I like that. Thank you, Gwen. Well, you know, I noticed that so many of us are of a certain age, and I had prepared. It seems that possibly what I had prepared for presentation and discussion today was not exactly what's on everybody's mind in terms of what kind of discussion you'd like to have with me. I love discussion, and for example, I'm looking at the chat questions right now, and they're two excellent questions, and I'd love to get into them. However, since La Plata County is your congressperson is a certified gun nut, Lauren Boebert, I actually prepared a book report. I just got a notice that I'm running out of juice, so I'm gonna have to go get my my charger. But I prepared a book report on this book, which is loaded, a disarming history of the Second Amendment. by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who is a um, uh, uh, historian and happens to be a friend of mine. And in it, she puts forward a thesis about why the Second Amendment is so powerful today, about what made it. The Second Amendment was not a big deal until the 1970s. There's very little law concerning the Second Amendment. It became a political issue in the last 40, 50 years. And the question is why? And why is it so powerful? Now, I don't know the connection between this book and the thesis. Incidentally, I read this book twice and I learned so much, and I found it was absolutely fascinating about American history. I don't know the connection between American history and what we should be doing. Because the real question right now is, what do we Democrats or what do we progressives, what should we be doing? And what Roxanne, who's a historian, does is she goes into the origins of the Second Amendment and explains what it is. In brief, well, it's not quite that brief. So what I did was I prepared a book report. I thought it would be fun to do a book report and about the book I read. I read it twice. And I would like to do that book report, and I have notes, which I will explain. However, I noticed that so many people want to discuss my history and our shared history. So I think I'm going to propose that we do this in two parts. First, we can have the discussion on that history, and then maybe leave some time at the end, and I can talk about this and raise some questions. Now, I'm going to run off now and be back in about 30 seconds with my charger. Okay, don't go anywhere. Well, I'm 73 3/4. I started as a freshman in 1965 at Columbia University.
Yep, I was a freshman in 67.
I demonstrated at Columbia in '68.
Ah,
Yay.
Okay.
I'm
So
Mark's
is that-
age. I'm Mark's age, 69, graduated.
All right.
So,
If everybody can mute again, then we'll let Mark continue.
so how should we proceed? Might I begin by addressing the questions?
However
would
you
that
want
be
to do
a
it,
good way?
Mark. Yeah, just do it however you think is best. I mean, we're here to listen to you.
Okay, I'm absolutely fascinated by what Roxanne has to say about the history and the significance of the Second Amendment, and I think it speaks exactly to the problem that you're facing in political organizing, which is, how do we confront this? I don't have a solution because it's very deep. But I did write to Roxanne and ask her what she suggested, and at the very end, I'll tell you what she wrote. How did we? Okay, this is from Daniel Morgenstern. How did we baby boomers and others manage to stop the war in Vietnam, but fail to stop the military-industrial corporate complex from taking over and polluting our natural resources and taking the wealth out of the middle class? I think the short answer, my short answer is they were much better organized than we were. We were organized well enough to stop the war, which is a pretty amazing historical phenomenon when you think about it, because it's very rare in history that I know of when a popular movement stops a war of aggression on the part of its government. And of all the things that I am proud of. It's having been a part of that movement. Now, a slight parenthesis here. The Weather Underground, of which I was one of the founders, I do not consider to be very useful to that movement. In fact, I consider it to be to have worked against the mass movement. But the mass movement itself worked. Our goal was to stop the war in Vietnam, and we did. And the Vietnamese always knew they knew very well that if there weren't an anti-war movement in the United States might have been able to occupy South Vietnam as long as the government wanted, which in fact is the case with us now in the Middle East. That particular war started at the end of 2001, and now we're 20 years of occupation in the Middle East. So the Vietnamese consider us to have been the anti-war movement to have been a very successful movement, and they thank us. In 2015, my wife and I went to Vietnam. It was the trip of a lifetime. We went with Vets for Peace, and everywhere we went, well, in Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, there's a war remnants museum that honors, on the first floor, it honors the international anti-war movement. Now, how did that work? That movement? That's an interesting question, and I'll just take it up in a second. For a second, a sociology graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley, took up the question: how did the Vietnam War movement win? Tom Wells' The War Within, and what he came up with was pretty surprising. He interviewed all the war managers he could get a hold of. I think this was in the 90s. And people like McNamara and Dean Rusk. And he found that the anti-war movement was in every single one of the war managers' families. In other words, they couldn't get away from it. The war managers, the war planners, the generals, they all had it in their families. That's how big the anti-war movement was. And it involved women, and it involved students, and finally the United States, I mean, and it involves soldiers. That's another thing, because it was a draft. So I could go on and on and on about the differences. Now, as far as the industrial corporate complex that Daniel refers to, they have a lot of money, they're very organized, and they know that the goal always has been power. Those of us in the anti-war movement, we're the kind of people who didn't like power. Power is coercive. You know, we tend to be people who are live and let live. You know, just leave us alone. We'll leave you alone. We're tolerant. We didn't go for power, but the far right has known that its goal was power since way before Barry Goldwater in 1964. And I find that even now, it's very, very hard to convince people who agree that that we need to remake government. It's very hard to convince people to do the work which you're doing, the Democrats are doing, to go for power. And I could talk about that particular pathology for hours, but just to say, power involves compromise, and it involves strategy and a lot of work. The far right did it. So any comments anybody want to say to that, to what I just said? I could go on any of these points. No? Then Dick White, during the Columbia protests and related events in 1968, in which you played a prominent role, even my small graduate department had at least one of our fellow students participating in the building occupation, a couple joining the counter protesters, and so others of us seeking to occupy a neutral middle ground. How would you compare the kinds of divisions we experienced then with the deep political division in America today? Just I'll get to the second part, but I just want to comment on the fact that in your department, Dick, you had people on all sides. SDS's goal, the goal of the Students for Democratic Society chapter at Columbia, was to politicize the campus. I joined that movement in 1965, and it had already been going on in terms of criticizing the university's participation in the war by having a naval ROTC courses. And that had happened well before I got there. But what happened over the course of years of organizing, literally years, we talked to people. We raised the issue of the war in Vietnam. We taught people what the war was about, teach-ins, for example. We knocked on doors in dormitories, and we created disruptions. We held civil disobedience. I remember getting reprimanded for sitting in an ROTC campus class, and all of these things politicized and the student body, and that was our strategy. That was our organizing strategy. So your astronomy department was really actually indicative of the whole university. Now, of course, there were events that happened, such as Martin Luther King's murder on April 4th, 1968, and Harlem blowing up, riots, fires that night. And for those who don't know, Columbia is on a hill here on a ridge, and Harlem stretches for miles to the east. And that at the time was the capital of Black America. And so it was very hard to not be political. You had to work at it back then. So one thing, one difference is how deeply apolitical young people have become. I think a lot because of the entertainment culture and all the distractions that they have. But in terms of the deep political divisions that we have, I think that speaks about white supremacy. I think and that is actually part of Roxanne's thesis, which is that as a reaction to the civil rights movement, white supremacy has grown, and that dovetails with the gun culture, which is deeply ingrained in people. And what that gun culture of the Second Amendment refers to is the fact that the Second Amendment appears in the US Constitution precisely because guns and murder and militias were a key part of what made the United States the United States. And that history is deep. But it's enshrined in the Second Amendment as an individual right, not just a social necessity, well-regulated militias. So she asked the question, well, first she talks about the history. And the history is pretty bad, and it's horrendous. And about all the mythologies that deny that history. But at its core, the idea of the Second Amendment is that every white man needs to have a gun, because that was the history of the first 160 years that led up to the American Revolution. And the purpose of militias didn't end at all with the American Revolution. It just intensified. Now it's that deep racism at the core of what the United States is. That's what she uncovers, and that's what the Second Amendment is about. Now I could go into more detail on this, but before I do, are there more questions about the past? Anybody want to know about bombings or being a fugitive, or why I did these crazy things, and how I think about the violence as a political strategy now? Any of it? We could talk forever, but anyway, I'll open it up now. Anybody? You want me to?
Mark, it looks like there's a fair number of other questions in the chat.
Oh,
So maybe
yes, yes.
we can either, you can read them or we can let Karen read them to you. We've done that both
No,
ways.
well, we can all read them. I'm looking at them. I just got to get rid of this.
I could read them because I don't know if everybody's here on Zoom or if
Okay.
someone on the phone.
Uh,
I don't think we have any phone call-ins.
yeah, I got to turn my phone off. That's what I got to do. That screws things up.
Well, Mark, have you read Democracy in Chains?
What's that?
Have you read Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean?
No, I haven't. Do you want to talk about it a little?
You would love it. Yeah, she really talks about the 50-year agenda of libertarians and, of course, now the GOP to reduce government, of course, but all the different subjects that they are using to gain power. And when you started talking about this book, Loaded, and a lot of us here are gun activists, you know, we're with Mothers Against, I'm sorry, Carol, what's the name of it? So many organizations against guns, and it makes a lot of sense. And I'm wondering if abortion was dropped over the years as people became more knowledgeable about it. Abortion was a big issue back in the day, and now it's guns.
Now it's guns, yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned libertarianism. In one of Roxanne's chapters, she talks about the connection between the militias and the all the various conspiracies and the general anti-government movement. Well, the idea, what she talks about the anti-government movement is that the owners, the corporate ruling class does not want government regulation. That's what's fueling all of this at the top. We're all familiar with the Koch brothers and how many organizations they've founded. They actually founded the Tea Party and kept it going for all these years. But they fed the individualism that the gun seems to represent in the far right's personal individual mythology, that somehow the purpose of the Second Amendment is to protect society and the individuals from the government. That has no basis in the origin of the Second Amendment. The origin of the Second Amendment was to arm every white citizen, male, in order to make sure that the settler colonial expansion would continue across the Allegheny and Appalachian mountain ranges. And that was what the revolution itself was fought for. I could go into that history. I find it fascinating to revise the history of the American Revolution. So I could go into that. But what you were raising, Karen, I think is very interesting in that the question of how did the gun thing become involved with protection against the government? How did it become an anti-government movement? And I think the answer is that it was all manipulated. It was all, and all these conspiracies, all of this, the government is controlled by liberals who love black people. I mean, all of this crazy stuff. They're coming to take our guns, and it hit an enormous plateau when Barack Obama was elected in 2008. They're coming right now to take our guns, but nobody's proposing that. But outside of Beto O'Rourke, very few people are proposing taking their guns. No, individualism and libertarianism dovetail with white supremacy, and the white supremacy is deep. And after the civil rights movement, basically, when you think of it, Reagan's rise, the rise of the contemporary conservative movement is based on switching the Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, to Republicans, and promoting the racism. And it's worth repeating, but I'm sure everybody knows when Reagan announced his campaign for president in must have been 79 or 80. He did it in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is where the three civil rights workers had been murdered in 1964. So that was the dog whistle. Now it's gotten to the point where it's perfectly fine to be openly racist with Trump. I just want to add, back in 2016, when Trump was elected, I got really mobilized, and like a lot of people did. I'm sure that all of us got mobilized when Trump was elected. And my thinking was that it would take about 20 to 40 years to reverse the damage that Trump was going to do in 4 years. Now it's 4 years later, actually it's 2021, and my prediction is still the same. It's still going to take 20 to 40 years to reverse the damage. And even though we have a Democratic president, just have a long way to go. So my strategy, what I've been advocating for the last 4 years, has been a dual strategy, which I think probably everybody is working on in one way or another. The dual strategy borrows from the experience of the anti-war movement during Vietnam, which was a movement outside of a political party that was issue-oriented and involved enormous numbers of people. I've run across the term momentum-driven mass movement. That's what the anti-war movement was, a momentum-driven mass movement. That's why at Columbia University, the astronomy department had people in that mass movement, and why every succeeding freshman class was more radical than the previous. It had momentum-driven mass movement. I think the movement against global warming is one such movement. The movement Black Lives Matter and against mass incarceration and police violence. That's a momentum-driven movement. And gun control, momentum-driven movement. So that's one area of work, mass momentum-driven movements or momentum-driven mass movements. Then the other area is what you and I are also involved in, which is a structured movement for power. See, mass movements can sometimes work. We actually did help end the war in Vietnam. The women's movement, the gay movement, did bring actual legal changes. But none of these mass movements take power. So what we're engaged in, and it appears as if the only movements that take power are structured movements, movements that last a long time and where people live their lives within them. The far right understood that. And their big step in gaining power was when they were able to enlist the white Protestant evangelicals as base level structures that reliably produced votes for the Republican Party. Notice that when Trump was elected, 80% of all Protestant evangelicals supported him. 4 years later, after all of the cruelty and the viciousness and the horror of racism was all exposed, 80% of all Protestant evangelicals still supported this sociopath. And the reason is they lived their lives within churches. And all of their friends are in churches, and it's all self-reinforcing. And the minister tells them again and again and again that it's Jesus's desire that they have guns. The Second Amendment is Jesus's work, because that is somehow related to stopping abortion. I mean, it's this whole nexus, and it works. Well, the Democrats, we don't have that. We used to have unions. I mean, all of us are of a certain age, I think. I don't see pictures of some people, but when I was a kid, you grew up in a union family. You know, everybody voted the way the union voted, and they voted together, and and it was a social phenomenon. And now that's gone. So there's no permanent, reliable structures except for the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party has become a kind of a shell. In New Mexico it is, and I suspect in La Plata County, it's pretty much the same, where you have a few people who are handling the affairs of the party, and the other people come and go. Somehow we're going to have to change that. And I'm hoping that young people get the idea that in order to get power, they have to organize within structured movements. So the mass momentum-driven movement is not sufficient. That's where I come to the Democratic Party. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party has got to have a strategy to take over the Democratic Party. But it's going to take a long time, because most places in the United States are not a majority progressive. Or if they are, the potential progressive voters don't vote. You know, we're not all in districts like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. That's going to take a lot of work. And the model for that, to get out the potential progressive vote, I look to Georgia and Stacey Abrams and the Black women of Georgia, who have organized for the last 10 years successfully in a place that is deeply ridden by Republican racism. So I don't know what question I'm answering, but that's what's on my mind. What's on other people's minds?
Well, there's a couple people who want to hear more about your experiences and what you were thinking and feeling. And what does Carol say? How your experience relate to the divisive challenges facing us today? So people want to hear about you.
Okay. Oh, look at all these wonderful questions. Wow. Jeez, that's a lot. Okay. I was 20 years old in 1968 when the Columbia strike broke out, and I suddenly became a national symbol as a lead, the crazed student radical with the megaphone. In fact, I think what's the name of the cartoonist? He created a character, Megaphone Mark. No,
Gary Trudeau.
Trudeau. I became Megaphone, or he stole Megaphone Mark. What happened was my friends and I overestimated the importance of our audacity in creating the Columbia strike, and we underappreciated the years of very slow organizing work that had gone into it, of which we had participated. But the difference was we were younger, and also most of us came from apolitical families. See, the early organizers at Columbia were red diaper babies. Does anybody remember that metaphor? Red diaper babies? That's children of communists or socialists or labor organizers. Kids who grew up in families who knew about demonstrations, labor union strikes, and supporting civil rights in the South. And they were the leaders of the Columbia strike, of the Columbia SDS before I. In a sense, they were the previous generation, although they were only a few years older. Their mantra was build the base, organize. And why? That's because that's all of the labor movement and the civil rights movement and all the previous movements had been built on organizing. They were not spontaneous. Those of us who came later, we saw how quickly things developed. And we said, no, we have to act now. We have to disrupt, and more people will join us. And so that became our strategy. It's a crazy strategy. It sort of makes a little bit of sense, but it doesn't work. So we undervalued the work that had gone in to politicizing the campus, the organizing work, and we overvalued our own actions in essentially civil disobedience. In other words, people do not join movements because they see other people acting. They join movements because they've spent a long time thinking about stuff and about what their relationship is to the movement. Now, this had an international component that we were extremely attracted to. Has anybody ever heard of a guy named Che Guevara? Che Guevara. Now, I was a Guevarista. I believed that Che Guevara was a hero, the heroic guerrilla. That's what they actually called him in Cuba. He was dead. He died, and he was murdered in 1967. But my friends and I adopted a strategy that Che had put forward. we were intellectuals. We read books. And one of the books we read was by a French intellectual, young guy named Régis Debray. It was called Revolution in the Revolution with a question mark. And it was based on discussions with Fidel and Che before Che went to Bolivia. And they put forward the theory that to start revolution, all you have to do is take action and the people will join. And there's a reason why they put forward this idea. It's because it served them, the idea served them as an analysis of what had happened in Cuba from 1956 to 1959. If you remember, Fidel and Che had invaded in 1956 and gone into the mountains and started guerrilla warfare. But what they wiped out, what they erased from the historical memory, was the fact that labor unions, students in the cities, middle-class people had all protested the Batista dictatorship, and 20,000 people had been murdered by the dictatorship in the cities. And there was an enormous movement. Well, what the FOCO theory, that was the name of it, FOCO means nucleus. What the FOCO theory did was it eliminated all of that. It said you don't need organizing. You just have to start armed struggle as we did, and you will win. And we were so enamored, my friends and I, my clique, my faction in SDS, were so enamored of this because it would make us the heroes. And it was very male. It always involved guns and bombs. And so we were so stupid, we didn't notice that Che had failed. The strategy does not work. In Bolivia, armed struggle became isolated from the peasants. And the Bolivian army and the CIA was able to pick off Che relatively easily. You know, people don't join spontaneously. It takes organizing. But we were impatient, we were young, we were very male, macho driven. Even the women were macho driven and wanted to prove ourselves. And so I have a lot to say about this. I wrote a book about it, and nobody under the age of 65 has ever read the book, but there might be a lesson or two for someone younger, which is don't think that by punching a fascist in the face, it's going to start a mass movement. But it's the hard organizing that does. So what I tell young people now is look to successful social and political movements and see how they organized. So myself, I'm involved in a 20-year personal study of the civil rights movement in the South, 1945 to 1965, because I think that it's one of the great accomplishments of the 20th century. And one of the things I learned is that nonviolence is an important successful strategy. And I could discuss that if you want, but more questions. More questions. What's
Carol,
it like to be a federal fugitive for 7.5 years? How about that?
Yes.
My mother was terrified the whole time. Of course. I was terrified. In 2003, a movie came out called The Weather Underground. You can find it for free online, and I'm featured in it. as well as other people, but I'm sort of the through line in it because I'm the only one that's willing to discuss the past honestly and not heroically. Um, uh, so there was a showing at the Jewish Community Center in West Orange, New Jersey, as part of the Jewish Film Festival of the Weather Underground. And my mother and 250 of her closest cronies were all in the audience. So after the movie, I stood up and started answering questions, and my mother started screaming in the front row, "I got a question, I got a question." And I said, well, what is it, Ma? What's your question? And she said, "I've been waiting 30 years to ask you this. How could you do this to me?" And then I gave her the microphone and she went at it. So, if my kids had done what I did to them, I would consider them to be monstrous. And I think I was a little monster, not taking my family into account. I think the violence of the war, the extreme violence, just drove us nuts. And we wanted to do something, and we glommed onto Che Guevara and Black Power. That's another thing. The civil rights movement itself, if you'll remember, it had morphed. Around 1964 was the beginning of Black Power, and Martin Luther King's leadership, which was the goal was integration through nonviolence. That leadership was in eclipse by the time I was 17 years old, literally. And so when I got to Columbia, the first story I heard from the SDS kids was how the white liberals in the North had betrayed the civil rights movement at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City in 1964. Does anybody remember this incident? What happened? No? Democratic, LBJ was being nominated, right? But what had happened in Mississippi was that SNCC had been organizing since 1961 for the right to vote. People had been murdered. People had been jailed, beaten for years on end. But they won. And how that victory took place, that's important to understand and to go into. But just for now, they won. They won the Voting Rights Act. They won the right to vote. However, the Democratic Party in Mississippi did not allow Black people. It was an all-white segregated party. So the civil rights workers went to the Northern Allies, the United Auto Workers, Hubert Humphrey, the vice president. I think he was vice president at the time. And they said, we demand that the Democratic Party of Mississippi allow Black people. And they wouldn't. So they formed their own Democratic Party called the Freedom Democratic Party. Does this ring any bells? Freedom Democratic Party. And they sent delegates by bus from Mississippi to Atlantic City. Now, a deal was worked out that they would be seated, the delegates. But at the last minute, LBJ had an emotional, mental crisis and decided there was no way he was going to let it happen. So they were denied what they had fought for and won, which was the right to vote, but the right to participate in the Democratic Party. Because LBJ knew that if they seated them in '64, he'd lose the election. That was called the betrayal of the movement, of the Black freedom movement, by the white liberals. I heard this story the year later. I was in high school. I wasn't paying attention. And my conclusion, as was the conclusion of all of my friends, was we didn't want to be white liberals. We wanted to support Black power. Black power was the idea that Black people would determine their own destiny. And it was led by young people. You'll remember the names Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown. They were SNCC people, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That was our sister organization of SDS. So we wanted to support them. And in supporting them, whatever they said, we agreed. Now, one of the things that Black Power said was, by any means necessary. Well, that implies a lot of things, by any means necessary. And it actually was a code word for violence. Just like now, there are code words that the anarchist kids use. One of the code words is diversity of tactics. Means you won't tell me what to do, I won't tell you what to do. You do your nonviolent thing, I'll do anything I want. That's sort of libertarian anarchism. But still, it's a code word for violence, diversity of tactics. Back then, by any means necessary was definitely the code for violence. Now, at that time also in California was the rise of the Black Panther Party, and they were immediately attacked by the government. And some of you have probably seen this movie, recent movie, Black Messiah. Well, it's worth seeing. It's worth seeing, about the murder of Fred Hampton. A book I recently read, this is from Rodney Prophet. A book I recently read, How the South Won the War, is haunting me. It seems white supremacy is an underlying theme in this country since 1619, when slavery was first introduced. She also argues that the pushback on FDR's New Deal is alive and well, and the way the Koch brothers and others have advanced their anti-government agendas to ride the cultural wars, white supremacy, guns, abortion, energy, etc. Absolutely, that is completely congruent with Roxanne's thesis. But I want to add one thing about militias. The militias had two functions. The militias that are ordained, literally ordained in the Second Amendment, well-regulated militias being necessary. What militias did, well, what they were was groups of locally formed white men, all armed, whose job was to murder Indians and steal land. That's what they did. In the South, where there was slavery, the job included not only murdering Indians and stealing additional land, but also catching runaway slaves. Now, the thing that happened that led directly to the Second Amendment was the French and Indian War of 1754 to 1763. Now, notice it's called French and Indian War. What happened was that the British were fighting the French in Europe. That's called the 30 Years' War. Here, they fought the French in Canada, and they won. But what the Americans did was they went over the Appalachian and Allegheny mountain ranges and established settlements. And they did that using guns. The term ranger comes from people who went over the ranges in order to murder Indians and steal the land. And so you had thousands of them by 1764, 63, when the war was over and the English had won, had moved in to the former French territory. Now, what Roxanne explains is that the English didn't want settlers in the French territory. The French had developed over the course of 150 years of an extremely lucrative trading arrangement with the native people. It was lucrative for both sides, and it took no soldiers to make it operate. It just worked. So the British, who were engaged in conquering India at that time, they wanted to keep that old system going, which was headquartered in Montreal and Quebec. But the Americans had already crossed the ranges. So in 1763, the British made a proclamation, no Americans over the ranges. And they had to send troops to get them and force them back and to keep more from coming. That was the origin of the Stamp Act of 1865, which demanded that the Americans, the colonists, pay for the British troops to keep them bottled up. And that's what the American Revolution was about. The right to expand into the former French territory. The first laws of the United States, even before the Constitution, which was only ratified in 1791, the first laws were in 1783 and 1785, which were the Northwest Ordinance in 1785. It was how to divide up the land that was going to be settled. George Washington had become a millionaire at the age of 25 by doing land surveying and buying land in Western Pennsylvania. That was the extension of the original colony. And the same thing with Virginia extending down into North Carolina, the same kind of land speculation and murder. That's the origin of the United States. And it continued after the Second Amendment because it was how the country was going to conquer the continent. She uses many examples, individual examples like Daniel Boone. Why was Daniel Boone revered? Well, he was revered because he was an Indian fighter and got all the way to Missouri, through Kentucky. And why was Andrew Jackson president? Well, he had started out as a militia member in Kentucky, murdering Indians, and continued as a general, and then and moved the Indians. So anyway, it's getting to be 1:03. I could go on for days and weeks and months if you want, but I think the luncheon may be at an end. Gwyn, what do you think?
We can actually go until 1:30, and we've done that in the past. And
Okay.
it looks to me like everybody that's been on is pretty much still on. So why don't we keep going?
Okay. What would you characterize as successful political or social movements? The far right, anti-government, free markets, the religious belief that capitalist free markets will solve all problems. This kind of magical thinking morphed into a mass movement. And the way they did it, incidentally, was by joining with in the culture wars with the evangelical movements whose important issue was abortion. And Trump did not create this movement. He just put himself forward as a figurehead, and and Trumpism is going to exist a long time after Trump is gone. The gay rights movement. How does the gay rights movement reflect Che's and your notions of changing minds? Well, the gay rights movement is a great example of essentially nonviolent civil disobedience. There was a little fighting at Stonewall, but with the cops, but basically they organized, and they organized legally, though, even up to our time in terms of marriage rights. The AIDS epidemic and the demand for that the government support research and allow drugs to be used. That was all mass movement work. You know, it's very funny. Dr. Fauci, who I think is a hero, he opposed the CDC's involvement in development of medicines, and opposed the experimental use. And he came around. He literally came around, and the movement changed his mind. He's revered by friends of mine in the mass movement. So the gay rights movement, I think, in terms of Che's notions of armed struggle, I think most people have pretty well given that up, and for good reason. There's a last question. Colin Woodward, American Nations: A History of 11 Rival Cultures in North America. This thesis has been around for quite a while. I think there's some truth to it. I mean, Southern Colorado and New Mexico shares a history and a culture that I think is absolutely unique. But I think that even within that, the basic lines of division are still around race and immigration, and that's where I spend most of my time thinking about. So the local cultures, the regional cultures, they're all important. But here in New Mexico, we're completely riven with the same splits that you have. I mean, you have a Lauren Boebert, and for 8 years we had a governor named Susana Martinez who was a total mess. She wasn't any smarter or emotionally more together than Lauren Boebert. She was a crazy also. And that's because the Democrats, it's a majority Democratic state, we didn't organize for power. We didn't. And on off elections, not major general elections, the governor's election, Democrats don't come out. They're not structured in a base. So we had to put up with a crazy person like Susana Martinez, who really did terrible damage for 8 years. It's just now, after 2 years of a moderate Democrat, things are starting to get repaired. You know, the environmental protection was completely gutted, for example. Fannie Lou Hamer in '64 at convention. That's a perfect example. You can find that on Eyes on the Prize. You can see videos of Fannie Lou Hamer. What would you characterize as successful political and social movements? The labor movement, which supported the New Deal and went beyond the New Deal. The women's movement, the civil rights movement, which ended legal segregation. The gay movement, the gay rights movement, the disability rights movement, the women's movement. They're all successful social movements, and what I think what's needed now is for people to study them, especially young people, and to learn how they organized. Let me see.
I want to
Emily,
congratulate you on your interview from the Jacobin magazine. In the chat, if you guys know how to get onto the chat, I put the link in it. And it's a very recent interview with Mark.
thank you.
Oh, man.
Karen, Jacobin is I call them neo-Marxists. They're trying to resurrect the Marxism from the dustbin of history, and I find them very interesting in that anarchism was really the dominant ideology among young people up until about 2011. Marxism was really in eclipse, and I think that the death of socialism around the world was a key factor. The revival now represents a return to a kind of an analysis of capital versus labor. In other words, fundamental Marxism. That the contradiction in the world is between those who own so much and labor. Now, the way that this gets played out now, we still haven't quite figured things out, because, for example, the decline of offshoring and moving manufacturing to the third world, and the decline of unions and all of these things, and the development of gig economies, and all of it changes now the nature of labor, and so how to define the contradiction is not purely between those who own the capital and those who labor. For example, everybody is affected by global warming. And the people who have benefited from global warming are the petrochemical, in the petroleum and the fossil fuel industries, and have perpetuated it, and the economies that are based on it. So that raises the problem of global contradictions, and how to bring about a new global economy that's not fossil based, but doesn't put all the sacrifices on the part of the people who did not benefit, namely the global south, the poor nations. So, all of these things have still have got to be explored. For people who want to go deeper, I still read a magazine that's 70 years old, Monthly Review. It's radical economists, Marxists, who have a very deep understanding of the nature of contemporary capitalism. They predicted the mortgage bust, the financial bust of 2008. They saw it coming. They're the only people I know who saw it coming. I like the Jacobin people, and they are kind of like the theoretical wing of the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, and they're good people. But I'm more interested in organizing, and how organizing is going to happen now, and so they tend to be a little bit more theoretical. So I like them a lot. Here's
There's a question
one
in the chat about labor. Carol says, will President Biden be able to reinvigorate the labor movement after what the GOP has done to destroy unions?
Well, one could hope that there will be more government protection, for example, rather than of the right to organize. I'm not going to say it's not going to happen. I was a labor organizer, a volunteer organizer for 15 years, and the only thing I saw very little progress, even in government employment, teachers unions. But on the other hand, Biden could help. I I I I don't know. I just don't know. By labor, I take a broad view of labor, you know, in the sense of what keeps capital going. Well, part of it is consuming. You know, people who consume, are they part of labor now? Well, yes and no. I mean, they keep, you know, the demand is part of capitalism. So consumers become something in the system. We don't work for them, but we give them our money. Um, I there's not enough labor to go around. In other words, it's highly profitable to have a lot of people not working, put them in prison, and you can get government money for housing them in prison. You know, the the school to prison pipeline, of which I was a part at my community college for 30 years. I mean, we took high school failures and gave them more failure. It was acceptable at my community college. I taught basic math. It was acceptable to have a 78% failure rate in elementary algebra. I don't find that acceptable, but it's average. And you know, we gave them the same thing that they had failed at. I worked on math curriculum and pedagogy reform for 20 years, with very little success. And that's a whole other story. One book that I have in mind to write is my 3 big failures, and one would be the Weather Underground. A second would be the unionization struggle, in which we won, but we were unable to organize the next generation of teachers. They didn't understand what we understood about the nature of the unions. So those of us who had passed through the 60s, we still remember that a union is a democratic phenomenon, and that it involves us participating. And the younger people came along and they thought that the union was a third party that you pay money to. So they didn't understand what a union was. And then when we said, well, no, it's us, we are the union, and we decide on our issues, and we do our own grievances, and we negotiate our own contract. And they would then say, well, does that mean I have to go to meetings? And people would say, no, I don't want to go to meetings. I can't go to meetings. I'm too busy, you know. So democracy is really hard. That's one of my failures. And then the third failure was the math reform movement, because what happened was very interesting. We had a significant majority of teachers, math teachers, who wanted to improve things. We knew that what we had been doing was not working. Basically, all math education is rote learning. And people don't learn to think. It takes a lot of work on the part of teachers, and it takes a real engagement on the part of the students. So a certain number of politically conservative, but also lazy teachers didn't want to change anything. They wanted to do what they had been doing all along, which wasn't working. So they formed an alliance, a de facto alliance with the students. The students didn't want to do anything new because it would have involved more engagement on their part. And they just wanted to do the stuff they had seen before, with the hope that they would do it better. In other words, rote learning. So we failed. Ultimately, it was that coalition between the conservative and lazy teachers and the students who didn't want to put the effort in. You know, to really learn what math is about, just like to learn anything, you have to engage with the material, and the material is has to change, which we tried. Much more problem solving and much more thinking, rather than just rote learning. So we failed. So those are three of my biggest failures. I probably have more failures, but it's kind of rough to constantly be organizing and you know, I've had a tragedy in my life this year. I lost my son. He was 45, and I've kind of lost my energy to constantly be out there organizing. Organizing is a young people's game. It involves meetings with people and listening to people, and I can do it occasionally, but I can't do it anymore. You know, it's kind of it's been a bad year, but I was organizing like crazy, with not a lot of good success. Oh, that's another failure. The I was called a racist among by some non-white young kids here, because I was involved with them pretty heavily in organizing around the Democratic Party, basically, and I kind of saw myself as an officer in an army, but I forgot that the army doesn't exist. And so I got all confused, and I started telling people things that they didn't want to hear, based on my being an old guy, and things that I knew were not working. And I got called out as being a racist. That was a pretty good shock too. So I've had a lot of failures, and I certainly don't approach any of this as in any kind of heroic way. I mean, I feel like you and I are exactly in the same place.
Well, let's get you out of the failure mode, because I think that's you've done a lot of great stuff too. And
What's
maybe
that, Karen?
last two questions.
Yeah.
Gwen mentioned the can you talk about the rise of right-wing governments around the world? And then Carol's asking, how do we get today's young people to care about improving society's ills? Those are two huge questions. So
The rise of what kind of around the world?
the rise of right-wing governments.
Oh, yeah, I see it. You know, basically, even in the social democratic countries like Scandinavia, the capital became completely in power. In other words, the imbalance between capital and labor became enormously great. I mean, we see that every day in the United States, but it's happened around the world. And so the question is, who to blame? You know, so you take a country like Myanmar or Burma, you know, who should we blame for the continuing poverty? And the answer is the Buddhists can blame the Muslims. You know, there's a crisis in southern Arizona, for example, a coming crisis, which is you need water and electricity in order to live in southern Arizona. And that crisis has been developing for the last few decades. So the question is, who do you blame? And the answer is you have to blame the Mexicans. Well, that has no, it makes no sense. But it's the blame game, and I don't know, maybe there is an essential tribalism, you know. On the other hand, the Republican Party is terrified of the future. That's why they're trying to limit voting. That's because young people are much more integrated on a social level than we were. There's much more intermarriage between races. There's a whole area of Albuquerque, New Mexico, that's made up of interracial families, because that's where they gravitate. They're not it's the new areas, the suburban kind of looking areas that are pretty new, not the older established barrios. And people move there because the housing is better and cheaper, but also because there's no gangs and there's no interracial warfare. So the Republicans are terrified of the future, and so they need to establish to limit voting. And I think the future is ours. Most of us are not going to be around, but it's going to take an awful lot of organizing to get there. There's a saying, demographics is not destiny. And even though we are the majority, unless they're organized, it doesn't matter. We can become a minority rule country. We are a minority rule country. That's what the Senate is about, minority rule, right? And probably whatever gerrymandering took place in your district allowed the gun nut rural votes to outvote Durango. You know, I have a question for you. What is your strategy on dealing with Lauren Boebert and the gun nuts?
That's a really good question. And there are any number of people who are challenging, have already announced going to challenge her, and there are other parts of the Democratic Party that are raising money. And whether or not any of that's going to work, I don't know. It's a very red district. But the other thing that I hear is happening is that there are Republicans who want to take her on in the primary. So and we're of course, like everybody else, in the middle of redistricting. So we don't know exactly where that's going to end up.
Is the legislature gonna improve the district or make it even worse?
We put in commissions a couple of years ago where there's 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, 4 independents, and they are to come up with nonpartisan districts. And that process has started. Of course, they're having problems because the Trump administration didn't get the census done on time. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen. But I personally think that that's the way we need to go. The districting needs to become nonpartisan, and that's what's happening. I know that we really are running out of time, and I could sit here for quite a while and go over this, but I think we probably need to stop. So I certainly, Mark, appreciate your spending your time talking to us, and you had some things that really made me start thinking. So anytime that happens, I feel good about it. And if everyone again would just give Mark a virtual hand,
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. And that's
if you ever want to have a book discussion, let me know.
Okay.
Maybe we can have a book club.
Yep.
I learned so much from Roxanne, and she also has an indigenous people's history of the United States. Well worth reading.
All right, that sounds great. We appreciate it. Does anybody have any announcements that they need to make before we stop?
I
would love, go ahead. Mark, I would love your contact information. I think we're all on the same page here in this house. And I'd also like to extend our group condolences about the loss of your son. It has been a hard year, but that's a whopper.
Thank you.
I would like to just show a book, Witness to the Revolution. I hope you don't mind that I'm showing this book by Clara Bingham. It's got great stuff about Mark Rudd.
She's a journalist, but she has some relatives in Santa Fe. She's from a ruling class family in Tennessee or something, and it's an okay book.
Well, it's got good stories about you.
Yeah, I don't have
All
a
right.
copy. Anyway, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
for
everybody,
a great.
Bravo.
Stay in touch.
And we hope you'll join us again next month. So everybody have a great day. and appreciate you
I
being
don't do Zoom. My mental health depends on not doing Zoom.
here. Okay. Well,
Thank
maybe
you.
we'll invite you to come up and visit us when we get back to doing these in person. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, Gwen.